Becky Allen at the Education Data Lab in London. Unfortunately, we've chosen one of the days where it's become a bit like a building site around us. There's bandsaws going, the inevitable London bandsaw if you do an interview or a video. But we'll persevere. Thank you, Becky, for agreeing to do this interview.
It's a pleasure.
Can you tell us a little bit about Education Data Lab and what your role in it is at the moment?
So my background is that after I left teaching, I became an academic. I went and did a PhD. I'm an economist by training, and I went off to work at the Institute of Education. And I still have an academic post there, but I wanted to take some time out, a period of leave, to try doing things a bit differently. So I'd always done quantitative research on schools with the aim of providing some sort of narrative on whether government policy was working or not. But we wanted to set up Education Data Lab to try working in a slightly different way, to be more responsive to the policy environment and engage much more with schools directly in helping them to make sense of the policy landscape and also the data that they get on how they're doing in schools. So that's the background to how we set up. We're part of the Fisher Family Trust, and that is really integral to how we work, simply because we largely use the massive administrative data sets on pupils and on teachers, and the Fisher Family Trust maintains these databases, so we have a really, really lovely, secure data environment to work in, and that means we can work very, very fast when we do analysis, because all the data is ready there and it's cleaned and it's been prepared for us to use.
That's good. I mean, are there any sort of notable achievements you've had so far in terms of what you think are benchmarks?
I think as an organisation, we're really hopeless at thinking about impact and social impact and things like that. So our driving mission is always to do things that we want to do and that we enjoy doing, that make us really happy. But I think the things that we know the most about, and we've said the most about, are around school accountability, particularly around performance tables, about how to measure school performance, about what happens to schools when you do measure school performance, and how school performance tables can be subject to manipulation in such a high-stakes accountability system. So I think a very large part of the work we've done has really focused on these ideas.
This is the thing that we've come down here today for, really. Is years ago, it used to be called the man on the Clapham omnibus, to find out about what do the statistics actually show regarding the impact of grammar schools on local results. I mean, we have this phrase, the white working class, which the DfE has been wrapped over the knuckles for, I think, recently in a letter, or other groups of disadvantaged students, let's put it this way. So what do we know at the moment about generally the stats to do with grammar schools?
So I should start by just saying why it's really hard to know what the impact of grammar schools is, because for every child who lives in Kent who goes to a grammar school and secondary modern, we can't at the same time create a parallel universe where we put them through the comprehensive system and find out what happens to them. So we spend our time in the data trying to find people who look exactly like those people who are going through a grammar school system. And we have, broadly speaking, when we talk about the impact, we have two big sets of literature that looks at this. And one is the literature for people who went through grammar schools really quite a long time ago now. So a group of people who, for the most part, they were born in 1958. They were a birth cohort, which means that we tracked them from birth. We still track them now at the Institute of Education, and we know a lot about them. And some of them went through a comprehensive system, some went through a grammar school system. It was a time of reform, actually, so some went through a mixture of both, and we learned something about what happened to them. And the reason why I think it's important that we still talk about them is that because we know everything about their family background, we can be quite confident about what the impact of having gone to a grammar school is. The second reason it's important to talk about them is they've been around long enough that we can say what the true impact is on your long-term life chances of different types of education systems. So we can see their earnings, for example. So that's one group that we talk about. And the other group we talk about are the children today who go through a grammar school because they live in Kent and Medway, in Buckinghamshire or in Lincolnshire. And we particularly like to talk about these massive selective local authorities because where there are individual standalone grammar schools, it's very hard for us to locate the impact of them because the children who go to them come from all over the place and it's not clear where the counterpart, the places where the people who failed the 11 plus end up. So these people are really interesting to us because they tell us what modern day grammar schools are like, but the downside is we don't know much about them. We know their SATs data, their key stage data, and that's about it. And we don't know what happens to them in the long run yet because we haven't matched into data sets that tell us about their earnings. But roughly speaking, all of this literature pretty much says the same thing, which is that going to a grammar school is good. You're better off than you would be at a comprehensive school. When we say, well, how much better off? We're less sure how much better off, but it's probably quite a bit. So managing to get into a grammar school compared to going to a comprehensive school could raise your GCSE outcomes by as much as something like a third of a grade per subject. And that's a really, really big benefit. And then we say, well, what about people who fail the 11 plus, who go to secondary moderns? Well, the literature says mostly that's not a great thing to happen compared to getting to go to a comprehensive school. And they say, well, how bad? They say, well, not very bad at all. Something like, it might be really tiny effect, like let's say 10% of a grade. But the problem is that grammar schools create lots of people who fail the 11 plus and end up in secondary moderns. So then when we say, well, what's the overall impact? We can say, well, there's quite a big gain for a very small number of children and there's a very small loss for a big number of children. So overall, is that a system you would like? Well, that's actually your value judgment on whether that's the kind of redistribution of outcomes you want to see in society.
Yeah. Well, I was one of those people. I was born in 1956. I went to a grammar school. I didn't pass an 11 plus, strangely enough. I went through the faith school system. And the school did change while I was there from a grammar to a comprehensive. Quite an interesting experience for me. I don't know if I'd like to repeat it in that sense. So in a way, it seems to me it's like what is a pangolin, this whole thing, because you've got this sort of uneven scale, really. You've got some small bits of the country in which this is happening and whole swathes of the country where it's not. And being able to sort of find some equivalence must be very hard. I mean, what about the impact of grammar schools in areas with weak schools? Nick Gibb talks about bringing the DNA of grammar schools into sort of weaker. Can they improve those areas? I mean, is there a case to be made there?
So, let's talk about Knowsley, for example, because it's talked about so much in the education press as an example of a place where the education system, as it is, a relatively small number of secondary schools, simply hasn't improved. And Nick Gibb's response to that was, well, we've tried everything and we can't make the schools there get better, so why not throw grammar schools into the mix? I think the response to that would have to be, what do you think is actually likely to happen in Knowsley if you do that? So say you create one grammar school for every 5 non-grammar schools. Who do you think is going to be going to those schools? Well, one thing we know about Knowsley at the moment is that there are lots of students with more motivated parents who currently leave Knowsley to go to secondary schools elsewhere. So our best guess is that Knowsley grammar schools don't necessarily get filled up by children who live in Knowsley. And in fact, that's what you kind of see across the country. So we talk about the Trafford grammar schools and how fantastic they are. Well, they might be not. But what's true is that they're not educating the children of Trafford. There's a very large part of Trafford where not a single child in the last 5 years has gone to a Trafford grammar school. And they're serving a very, very wide part of the greater Manchester area. So our best guess is that something similar is likely to happen in Knowsley as a result. Which is not to say that the Knowsley secondary schools themselves won't lose any pupils at all. But then we ask the question, well, what pupils do they lose? And more importantly, what teachers might they lose? They might be losing their high-attaining, most motivated pupils, which you may think in itself has a damaging impact on the secondary schools that will then become de facto secondary moderns. But they may also be losing particular types of teachers. One of the things that we can see happening in areas like Kent is that there are great inequalities in the kind of teachers who teach in grammar schools compared to secondary moderns. So in grammar schools, you are far less likely to have teachers who are unqualified. You've got much larger numbers of teachers who've been qualified for 10 years or more, so very experienced teachers. Your churn of teachers in grammar schools is very low.
Oh, right.
You're much more likely in a grammar school compared to a secondary modern to be taught by a teacher who has an academic degree in the subject that they're teaching. This is particularly pronounced in subjects like physics, in science in general, and in maths. So these inequalities that ultimately become social inequalities in who gets access to high quality, suitable teachers become very pronounced where you have academic selection, grammar schools and secondary moderns. Which is not to say that these social inequalities don't happen across the country. You know, we all know that vacancy rates are higher in schools that serve more disadvantaged communities, that these schools struggle to recruit, they have fewer people applying for jobs, and that the same patterns that I've described of having non-specialist teaching subjects you see in more disadvantaged schools. The question is just to what extent do those social inequalities get more pronounced within selective systems? And our evidence is that they really do. And so that's my greatest concern, is if we introduce a grammar school to Knowsley, it may or may not be great for the children who get to go. But what we do know is, by its very definition, the majority of children in Knowsley will not get to go. And what happens to them? I don't think it's reasonable for us to assume that everything is just the same for those children. And we may say, well, things are not great at the moment in Knowsley schools. Actually, I've never visited them. I don't know what they're like. But it is possible they could get a lot worse. And I think we have to consider that possibility in the grammar school policy.
That's interesting. Can you tell people about Progress 8? Because, I mean, there's a vast swathe of teachers, especially in primary, who don't understand what it is. And to compare that with secondary moderns, and is there a bias there?
So Progress 8 takes two children who've got exactly the same Key Stage 2 scores at the end of secondary school, and it asks who does the best at GCSE. And it's counting up the GCSEs you get across your 8 best GCSEs, but they have to include maths and English. 3 of them have to be EBAC subjects. So what you're always doing is making these comparisons between children who have the same Key Stage 2 scores. Now, early on we pointed out, and others have pointed out since, that there's a social gradient on Progress 8. And what that means is that schools that serve more affluent communities are likely to have better Progress 8 scores than schools that serve more disadvantaged communities. And at first glance that doesn't seem logical, because we're measuring progress, not attainment, and we think it should therefore be fair, because the schools that serve more disadvantaged communities should have lower attaining children and therefore have less expectation for final GCSE results. The problem arises because if we've got two children who have the same Key Stage 2 scores, but we see that one goes to a very affluent school and one goes to a very disadvantaged school, even though they appear to have the same Key Stage results, we know that they're different. We know that they're different because they're going to different kinds of schools, and we know that in all likelihood they've got very different types of families and very different home environments. They may actually have different academic capabilities that haven't been measured by the SATs. And so it's for that reason that you don't really see any grammar schools that have negative Progress 8 scores.
Right.
And it's hard for schools that have very, very disadvantaged intakes to achieve positive Progress 8 scores. Now, there's a particular problem that goes on with the grammar schools and the secondary moderns that's an example of this, I guess. So a grammar school, on the whole, has children who have very high Key Stage 2 scores. Typically, to get into a grammar school, you're going to have a Key Stage 2 score on the old metric that's above 5, well above 5, so a fine grade of 5.1, 5.2 or higher. And yet, when we look at grammar school data, there's always these children in grammar schools that have low Key Stage scores. Some of them are amazingly low. So you'll have a child that has something like a Key Stage 2 fine grade of 4.3, 4.4. This is on the face of it a low attaining 11-year-old, and yet we know for a fact they passed the 11 plus. So the question is, which is the truer measure of their academic capabilities and their attainment at the age of 11? Is it the 11 plus, or is it this SAT score, this Key Stage 2 score that we can observe? What we see with these children is that when they go to grammar school, they appear to make amazing progress so that they have really great GCSE results. Now that gives us a clue that probably the SATs data, the Key Stage data, just was not accurate. The consequence of that is that we then assign amazingly high progress of these very low Key Stage 2 attaining children who go to grammar schools to the grammar school. And we say that is your benefit, right, and that's your progress. Right. When in fact, probably all the progress was being made at primary school and they are wrongly picking it up. And then for secondary moderns, the reverse is true in the sense that there are children with incredibly high Key Stage 2 scores living in a place like Kent, a fully selective area, and we see them at a secondary modern school, which suggests to us that they have probably, in all likelihood, failed the 11 plus. Mm-hmm. And again, so they go on and they appear to not do as well as other very high attaining children at GCSE. Now, the system, Progress 8, says, well, that's because the secondary modern didn't do well for them. But we're concerned, and I think in all likelihood, it's the case that their Key Stage 2 scores were overstating how academically able they actually were at the age of 11.
And also there's the other mix is that the talk of being 11 plus test itself being tutor proof. And you have there's the kind of sort of what I call the occult bit, the hidden bit, that in the fact that you don't have data on 11 plus. I don't know why that is. Is that a historical thing? And the other thing is the effect of the tutoring that's going into things. So those are two sort of parameters and things that you don't really see and can you account for. Is it possible to have an 11 plus tutor proof test, or is that the right age? I mean, it was discussed at the Education Committee of going lower or even higher, and you mentioned yourself that there's a kind of sort of they're discovering now that older children are making more rapid progress in the latest research. So where do we fit on that continuum, if at all?
So when you're thinking about an 11 plus, you have to be clear about what it is you're trying to measure. And I think the government isn't really clear about this, and actually I think the schools themselves have never been clear about it. It's only when you think about what it is you're trying to measure that you can make sense of whether you're measuring it well or not. So is it that we think there's such a thing as a fixed capability to learn and we're trying to capture this IQ? Are we trying to measure the current academic attainment of the children in some form of kind of competition, and therefore that's what we measure? Are we trying to get a proxy for what their likely future academic attainment is going to be? And is that the same thing as their capacity to benefit from a grammar school as opposed to a secondary modern? So it could be all of these things. I don't know what it is because it's not my job to design the test. One of the problems, though, is I think whatever it is you think it is you're trying to measure, it's hard to get away from the fact that you have to measure something that looks like current educational attainment. And there are different varieties of it that are more or less aligned to the current primary school curriculum, of which the big question is really to what extent you want to include measures of things that are known as verbal and non-verbal reasoning that sit slightly outside the primary school curriculum. But it's very hard to get away from the idea that in order to figure out who's likely to be academically successful at the age of 16, we probably need to look at who's academically successful at the age of 11. And that is, of course, subject to how much that child has learnt. And how much that child is learnt is subject to how much they have been intensively taught. So I don't know philosophically how we get away from these things. But to talk about like the debate around tutor-proof tests. So traditionally, the tests that were used by grammar schools had a very strong reasoning component in them. They were using non-verbal and verbal reasoning. Right. Not taught in primary schools. If you want to do well in those tests, it's really important that you practice them in advance. You historically used to go down to W.H. Smith's and buy these books and then practice the questions. Or you can go and get a tutor. But it's important to get at least some practice in them. And if you don't have parents who are familiar in these tests, you need to go and purchase help. So a group of researchers up at Durham at Chem decided that this was a problem for the tests, and that therefore the solution was to devise a test that's more closely aligned to what children at the age of 11 actually are being taught at school, which is a completely reasonable idea. Mm-hmm. So they say, well, why not? Let's just weight much more heavily on the maths and English that you're learning in primary school, and let's just test on that. That was one idea that they had. The second idea was, well, one of the ways you prepare for a test is knowing what a test looks like. So if we don't say what it's going to look like, and if we change the nature of the questions from year to year, and we don't make the past papers publicly available, then we can stop people from preparing. And so about 40% of grammar schools now use these Chem tests that were purported to be less susceptible to tutoring. And I think they've largely been a disappointment. And we say that simply because the proportions of free school meal children getting in any of these areas just hasn't changed that much. Mm-hmm. And that gives us a clue that the tutoring is still having an impact. And there's one possible reason why. And the possible reason why is that if you have a test that's it's hard to prepare for, and it's hard to prepare for because the only way you can get better is to actually get better at maths and to get better at English, broadly defined, and you're not going to know what the questions are like. The only way you can prepare is to put in a lot of hours. Yep. And so it's possible that there's been a response by wealthier families of not tutoring less because there's no point, but in fact tutoring more, because it's so hard to prepare for the Chem test, because you've got to prepare for every conceivable style of question that might come up, the entire Key Stage 2 curriculum and beyond that might come up. And so that's one plausible explanation that we haven't yet tested, but as to why there's been a response by parents that means that their tutoring is still having an impact.
Right. Yes, it's very complicated. So on the other side of things, I mean, you've got like King Edward the Sixth is talking about different criteria for pupils from disadvantaged backgrounds going in, and giving people entry via lower pass marks. And it seems to me quite strange that if you're going to have a system whereby it's attainment or achievement and academic, why would you do that then? Because then why not have a comprehensive? It seems somewhat illogical. I mean, that's being pointed to by the government pointedly. I mean, what's your response to that?
I agree that once you get into the idea that this is a competition, some people win prizes, some people don't, and yet we're going to discriminate, that it becomes very divisive and we set groups of society against each other. So to give some examples, I mean, is it okay if we allow lower pass marks for August-born children compared to September-born children? Because we do. Is it okay if we allow lower pass marks for boys? Because we do. Is it okay if we allow lower pass rates for people who are on benefits and therefore receive free school meals? Because they do in Birmingham. But they do that when there are other families who have lower incomes by virtue of being the working poor and therefore not receiving benefits, who are not getting those places. And so in what sense is that fair? And so we talk about these kind of just about managing families, and we say, well, let's give them opportunities too. But aside from this very complex question of how on earth do we identify who these people are, at what point do we draw the line? Because if the line is going to ultimately be drawn that everybody should get a chance up to the people who are actually managing very well, thank you very much, but certainly can't afford private school, then the whole idea becomes nonsensical. But then there's also much more controversial issues, which are that the chances of a child from a black ethnic minority background or an Asian ethnic minority background getting into a grammar school even looking across children with exactly the same key stage 2 scores, their chances of getting in are much, much higher. So the worst group at getting into grammar schools is the white British group. Mm-hmm. So what do we do about that? Like, do we have discounting scores for the white British ethnic minority group? Because that's the logical consequence of arguing that we should have this positive discrimination against groups that are disadvantaged in society. But that sounds like racial profiling and racial discrimination to me. So
and will they achieve further on as well? That's the other question, isn't it?
Okay, so that's a separate question. So we get into this question of how should we discriminate. Then we get into the question of, in a practical sense, what does a grammar school start looking like if we let students in who have much, much lower qualifying scores? Now, in the case of Birmingham, the King Edward schools were able to barely lower the qualifying score. They have large numbers of ethnic minority free school meal children in Birmingham who are reasonably high attaining. They can give them places at grammar schools. But across the country, that's simply not the case. And we did some analysis where we said, well, how low does the qualifying score have to start dropping if we want to equalise the number of free school meal children in grammar schools compared to non-free school meal children? And in many parts of the country, it's going to have to be very low indeed, to the point where what we'll actually do within grammar schools is set up a bottom set that is made up entirely of free school meal children. How do we feel about that? Is that still a grammar school? Is it still a grammar school stream within a grammar school if this set is full of children who haven't passed the 11 plus ultimately? So I think these complicated issues haven't really been thought through by the government. My instincts are either we think that this is a competition where the elite should get to go to grammar school and we must accept that notion, therefore we have to have a fair test, or we don't accept that notion, in which case we've got to think about a different model for deciding who gets to go to school where.
Yeah, that's why I say, is it a pangolin? I mean, it's where do you end up? What do you think of the DfE's tweets recently? Because it seems to me there's been a charm offensive for parents backed up by rather dodgy, should we say selective statistics, let's put it that way. I mean, the UK Statistics Authority has more or less ticked off the department for using the term white working class instead of free school meals white, and not doing a like-for-like comparison between schools. So, I mean, is there a loose cannon there at the moment? It's not been signed off.
I have no idea who is involved in producing them or how it's being signed off. It feels political to me. I think there's a deeper argument that we've got to have with DfE, and I think DfE have to decide, and that is, can we have a grammar school without a secondary modern? And at the heart of the entire debate is this question. If we can have a grammar school without a secondary modern, then we can have some educational gains to a set of children. Now, you may or may not like who those children are, but at least we can talk about those gains. But if there are losses elsewhere in the system because we think that the presence of a grammar school changes the nature of other schools around them, then we have to have the conversation about what happens in those schools. And at the moment, every single piece of data and statistics that come out of DfE and come out of Nick Gibbs' mouth claim it is possible to have grammar schools without secondary moderns.
Yeah, I mean, he does say the evidence is 99% good or outstanding in Ofsted and 82% outstanding, as opposed to non-selective schools, which are 20% outstanding. But there's the scale between the two is quite obvious immediately. I mean, I don't know why anyone would want to say that, to be quite honest, in that sense. You've got this...
Well, sure, and nobody's denying that grammar schools are perfectly good schools where anyone would be happy to send their kids. That is not a question.
The man on the Clapham omnibus or the woman on the Streatham tube would say now, why can't I send my children?
Tom Sherrington, who was a head teacher at a grammar school, who now runs a very challenging comprehensive school, would say, actually it's not that hard to run a grammar school. It's not hard to teach at a grammar school compared to a comprehensive, and it's not hard to run a grammar school. And that's why actually Ofsted are completely right that they walk into grammar schools and what they see is well-functioning, orderly environments where children are learning stuff. So they tick the box and say this is all good. And that is absolutely the judgment they should be making on these schools. No one should be pretending that these aren't good schools. The question is, what do they do to all the other schools around them?
And you have the other thing that's saying it's popular with parents, 50% more popular in terms of first preference choices than other schools. I mean, what's your reaction to that? I mean,
well, you know, the more interesting question is actually, are these popular with the public? And the data is more equivocal on that, I think. So there's two dimensions to the data, and one is the age dimension that I think, roughly speaking, shows that the public on average is not in favour of grammar school expansion, just about, but that older people are in favour of grammar school expansion.
Well, that's interesting, because their parents more or less reacted against the system in the earlier stages, in the 60s and 70s, because it was falling apart, surely, historically. That was the case.
So they did. So then we have to get into this debate about why are we in a situation where we are thinking of recreating something that collectively as a society, Conservatives and Labour, decided wasn't working for us. And I don't think it's just the case that we're doing it because we've forgotten what 11 plus selection's like, although I think we have. I think there are other factors at play here, and I think one of the factors at play is that some people are disappointed at how the comprehensive experiment has worked out and have watched their children go through comprehensive schools, having been through a grammar or secondary modern themselves, and haven't been happy with the quality of education and the experience that their own children have had. You know, the promise of the comprehensive experiment was that we would have grammar schools for all. And I think people feel that didn't happen. And I suppose for people who are campaigning against grammar schools and in favour of a comprehensive system, I think they have to have a good hard look at why people who went through the schooling system feel that way about the schooling experience that they had.
Well, I mean, you talk about certain data like good teaching, people who've got a good academic background, those elements that were within the grammar schools. I mean, is it worth thinking about transplanting that into other schools rather than it just being this system of selection and in? I mean, is there an alternate way?
So historically, grammar schools were different in very practical ways from secondary moderns, because they actually provided a different curriculum with leading to a different set of qualifications. Whereas what we're proposing now isn't really that we're planning on doing anything different to the children that we're planning on putting into grammar schools. So we're planning on taking a set of children and putting them to grammar schools, and yet nothing different will necessarily happen to them. So I think the word grammar schools is being used as a proxy for something quite different, which is a traditional academic curriculum in an ordered environment with strict behaviour and discipline, where children can feel safe, where children can feel valued even if they're very intelligent and they want to work hard. And I think that some parents feel it's not possible for children to go through a comprehensive system and feel like that.
And also you've got this sort of, I don't know where it came from, didn't come from left field, but Tim Loyner talked about the Dutch system and this tripart system. The tripart system here didn't work many years ago either. I mean, the technical colleges were few, and you have the UTCs here now, which are sort of struggling in terms of numbers. I mean, how do you feel about that in terms of any data coming out?
I think his suggestion that we should stratify children and decide what sorts of jobs they deserve to have in life at the age of 11 or 12 is actually quite abhorrent. I think it's worse than the proposed grammar school system, where at least in secondary moderns we're giving people access to a general academic curriculum that gives them choices about the kind of person they want to be in life, and that they are able to function in society as a citizen like everybody else. So I am deeply against any sort of system that shuts down choices for children early on. And I'm really against it, in part because whenever we ask children to make these things and we call them choices, what we're really talking about is asking other people's children to make choices. You know, so a child of mine is never going to go down a vocational track before the age of 16. They're never going to be told they should be going to a UTC because that's the kind of education that's suitable for them. And the reason why is that because I want my children to have choices in life, and in order to have choices in life about what you want to be, you have to have a general academic curriculum. And that means staying in a standard school with a standard academic curriculum to the age of 16. So that's one reason why I am so concerned. It's this social dimension that you get, but also just this shutting down of choices that we give children. I don't think that children can make choices about who they want to be in life at the age of 12. They may think they've got great ideas about who they want to be, but choices come from somewhere. They're socially conditioned by their friends, their family, their teachers, and we've got to be really, really wary about saying that those so-called choices that children make are things that we should legitimise and value and act upon, knowing that the consequences of the choices can be catastrophic for the rest of their lives.
So it's a thought to end on. Well, thank you, Becky Allen.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you.